Hi, I'm Cynthia Schneider, CEO here at the top of Virginia Regional Chamber, and I welcome you to this first of 3 educational forums on the marijuana industry in Virginia. Our goal is to present reliable information that will assist you in making educated decisions for your business in light of new and developing state legislation of the marijuana industry. Please note that the Chamber recognizes that there are many issues that need to be addressed due to the legalization of recreational marijuana, particularly the impact of this legislation in regard to health and the social fabric of our community. TVRC's focus will remain on the issues most directly related to business. Our 3 forums will hone in on First Today, an industry overview with basic terminology defined, a look at the science of the industry, and a look at current legislation. In the subsequent forums, to be held on Monday, August 23rd, and Monday, October 25th, we expect to discuss potential business opportunities. We'll hear from businesses currently involved in this industry, looking at the challenges and opportunities that they have. We'll discuss projected impacts like zoning and taxation. We'll look at the human resource management side of this and other questions and answers that we may need to find as our understanding unfolds. In addition, and this is a really big goal of ours, is to gather input from the business community that will help guide future legislation. We understand that our business owners are on the grassroots and will be the ones implementing many of the decisions made, and we feel that we need to help make your voice heard as those in the state and local levels are crafting the legislation that will guide this industry. You're welcome to submit questions today in the chat box. But due to limited time, and I'm sure lots of questions that you have on your mind, we may not get to yours today. And that's one of the reasons we've made this a 3-part series. We'll utilize your questions and use them to direct content for future discussion. We'll also be sending out a survey at the end of the event for you to submit questions and comments that will guide us in this continuing conversation. In respect of your time today, we will officially end at 1 o'clock, but the panelists have agreed to extend the Q&A for about 15 minutes, and this will be included in the recording. I want to thank today Blue Ridge Bank, who is sponsoring this forum series, and it's because of their support that we are able to include the entire community in this conversation at no cost. And here to welcome you on their behalf is Scott Moore, Winchester Market President for Blue Ridge Bank.
Thank you. Thanks to the Chamber for having this forum. We appreciate it. When Cynthia reached out probably about a month ago, it was something that we've been very active in since 2016. We started researching then as to how to get our feet in the door and what we could and couldn't do. In 2018, our board approved our marijuana-related business policy, and we started banking hemp and Tier 3 marijuana-related businesses. And so we've taken a little bit deeper dive in 2020 as legislation is starting to come out, and these policies and procedures are expanding in Virginia and in our market. Although we don't actively market to cannabis and marijuana-related businesses, we typically only do them for direct referrals and companies that can pass our due diligence tests. So this is something that we're on the ground floor with, have been, and we're excited for it. And I think we can all agree that banking's been banking marijuana since the beginning of time. We just haven't known about it. So let's try to do it the right way and put the best foot forward. So we appreciate it. Look forward to some conversation, and I'm excited. So thank you, Cynthia.
Thank you, Scott. Today's program will be facilitated by Ashley Shickle of the Northern Shenandoah Valley Regional Commission. Ashley's also a member of the Top Virginia Regional Chamber Public Policy Committee, and it's because of the work with the Northern Shenandoah Valley Regional Commission in this industry that we've asked her to facilitate today. Ashley, take it away.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. So over the last few years, you may have heard me advocating for additional research for cannabis, specifically the possibilities for industrial hemp in the Shenandoah Valley. James Madison University, with the support of Go Virginia Region 8 and 9 participating localities, was able to complete an economic and agricultural analysis of the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of the hemp industry. Today, we're looking at cannabis from another perspective. Our honored guests are going to provide some basic education and discussion on cannabis for recreational use. And our panel consists of 2 experts. Dr. Dan Downey is a professor of environmental, nuclear, and analytical chemistry at James Madison University. He has more than 35 years of experience in environmental research, and he leads the industrial hemp research team at JMU. Our second presenter today is Agustin Rodriguez, a partner at Troutman Pepper Law Firm. Agustin has more than 20 years of experience providing cross-functional, multidisciplinary counsel to consumer goods and services companies. Mr. Rodriguez handles complex litigation, marketing, advertising, tobacco, cannabis, alcohol regulations and restrictions, supply chain management and risk, internal investigations and corporate compliance, transactions and governance. As a reminder, for your questions and answers today, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. All questions will be recorded there, and it's the best way for us to save your questions for future discussion. So, without further ado, I am happy to get things started with a presentation by Dr. Dan Downey from James Madison University.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate being here today. This is going to be fun. I am beginning by calling this presentation Cannabis 101 because cannabis is a more comprehensive name than just marijuana, which is just one facet of the cannabis plant. Here's some young plants. Took this picture about a week ago. These will soon be transplanted to a greenhouse or the field to grow up to become industrial hemp plants for CBD production. My journey with the hemp industry, cannabis industry, began just over 2 years ago. Prior to that time, I was doing environmental analytical chemistry. We decided to do a project at this farm, which is owned by some friends of our family in Augusta County. And it was a producing turkey farm of about 250,000 birds per year. At the time we visited there, and we were interested in nutrient management, especially with its effects on aquatic chemistry in runoff. And at the time we visited, the owner told us that they were about to convert this farm into a hemp farm, get rid of the turkeys, clean these poultry houses out and replace them with hemp plants and put greenhouse roofs on the tops of these plants. And I said, say what? And at any rate, they decided to do this, and they have 4 poultry houses there. The roofs are replaced with this 6mm polyethylene plastic sheeting. The insides were gutted out and made acceptable for growing hemp. So this was a tremendous thing. And the owners mentioned to us at the time we were there that growing hemp had an Achilles heel. And that is that if the hemp plants showed greater than 0.3% of a compound called THC, that they would have to be destroyed with complete loss of the crop. And I said, whoa. And I said, well, what do you do in order to find out how much THC is in your plants? And they said, well, we send the plants off for laboratory analysis. I said, well, we have a pretty sophisticated lab over at JMU. Perhaps we can help you out with that. And that opened a can of worms that has continued from that time to present, where we have analyzed for free for a large number of valley farmers hemp plants to help establish THC content and for other ingredients as well. And I'll show you some of that data later on in this presentation. Now, it all starts with the sun. The sun is the source of all 100% energy on planet Earth. And this is the solar spectrum. The sun is basically a 6,000 Kelvin black body and emits light mostly in the visible UV and visible regions of the spectrum. You're familiar with Roy G. Biv, the colors of the visible light that you see. This is the spectrum that comes to Earth, and this is in red, the spectrum that's actually received at the ground level. So plants have adapted to make use of this light to produce biomass and oxygen. As shown in this slide, if you look at a plant leaf and it appears to be green, the reason that you're seeing green is because the red and the blue light is absorbed. Many pigments in plant leaves, but one of them is chlorophyll A, shown on the right-hand side of this slide. And that chlorophyll A acts as a catalyst for a process that you no doubtedly know, which is called photosynthesis. And photosynthesis takes two chemicals that are present in the air, carbon dioxide and water, and turns them into sugars and oxygen. All oxygen on planet Earth is the result of the photosynthetic process of converting solar energy into glucose and oxygen. And then those chemicals are in turn used by plants to build up other chemicals, in some cases quite complicated molecules, such as is found in the hemp plant. So I promised to give a little background of cannabis, its history. First record of cultivation is around 3000 BC. It originated in Southeastern and Central Asia and spread through the Middle East to Europe and then to the Americas. And the reason it spread was because it was useful. It was useful for producing the materials that we make clothing, ropes, sails, containers, and so on out of. Paper was a big source, use of hemp. It's also edible, and all parts of the plant are edible, including the roots, which can be boiled to make a soup, the seed, and of course, fiber. Medical uses dated back as far as 5,000 years ago in China, India, and Egypt. It was used as an antiphlegmatic and anesthetic for glaucoma, pain, migraines. In fact, the same uses are in vogue today for cannabis for various ailments that people have. There's a famous Greek historian by the name of Herodotus, who was around the 1st century AD, and he recorded that the Scythians used the hemp plant, the cannabis plant, for recreational use. By the year 800, the Arabians had embraced hashish, which is a concentrated keef of the marijuana plant, to get high, because Islam forbade the use of alcohol, but not of cannabis. And then in the 1830s, a British physician in India actually used cannabis medically to treat cholera. By the end of the 1800s, many medical uses were published in Europe and the United States. The US Pharmacopoeia added marijuana as a treatment for heroin addiction and so on in 1850. After 1900, cannabis was found in many medical formulations, both prescription and over-the-counter type things. But at the same time, in the history of marijuana and cannabis, the recreational uses were starting to increase. And this was superimposed upon an era of prohibition in which states and the federal government began banning alcohol. By 1937, there was something called the Marijuana Tax Act. And since marijuana and hemp are the same plant and indistinguishable from one another, unless you do a chemical analysis, that included hemp, and it basically destroyed the American hemp industry. This was followed by World War II, and U.S. government lost its hemp supply because Philippines were occupied by Japan during the first part of the war. And so therefore, that led to the United States encouraging industrial hemp being grown for the U.S. military during that period, but then it fell off again after that. By 1970, all cannabis was listed as a Schedule I drug, along with all of the really serious things like heroin. And the Soviet Union became the world leader in hemp production at that time. In 1973, there was a publication. It was only a 2-page publication, but it was in the prestigious journal Nature by 2 Canadian scientists called Smalls and Beckstead. And they were trying to distinguish hemp as a plant different from marijuana. And they said that the criterion that they chose was 0.3% THC on a dry weight basis. If it was more than that, then the plant was considered to be marijuana. Less than that, it was considered to be hemp. So that's where it all started. And that's where we get this 0.3% government regulation criterion has been fast forwarded from that point to present. After the year 2000, industrial hemp started making a U.S. comeback. By 2014, the U.S. Farm Bill allowed states to do hemp research. And in 2015, 4 universities in Virginia received grants to do hemp research, including UVA, VPI, Virginia State, and James Madison. The latter was orchestrated by 2 professors, Dr. Sam Morton and Dr. Mike Renfro. And I was not a part of that, didn't even know about it or care about it at that time. But those guys got things started at James Madison. Then by 2018, President Trump signed the Farm Bill, which allowed legal hemp cultivation, because through chemical analysis, there was a distinguishing from that and recreational marijuana. And that's what's led us to present time. We had about 2,000 acres grown in 2019, and then in 2020, about the same. And the numbers are yet to be recorded in the state of Virginia for hemp production, most of which is being grown for what we call CBD. Here is a picture of the Glen Rhodes farm, which is where this started with JMU. Included in this 8-acre plot are some acreage donated to JMU for research purposes. Shenandoah River is in the background. It's a very scenic location, and the mountains are in the Shenandoah National Park there in the distance. All right, so let's talk about the plant itself. The Latin name for it is Cannabis sativa. The L there refers to Linnaeus, who was a taxonomist who came up with this classification. The plant is approximately 70 to 80% water when it's grown live in the field. And there are 3 variants that you hear a lot about. C. sativa. Sativa means cultivated, indica, and ruderalis. Of these 3, there's probably no real genetic difference between them. We call them variants rather than species or subspecies. And there's a lot of hybridization that's taken place between these 3 plants throughout the years. But basically, if you talk about sativa, that's the most popular one. And that is the one that most people are growing in the United States. The plant itself is an interesting plant. There's these chemicals that we call cannabinoids or phytocannabinoids that are distributed throughout the plant, through the stems, through the leaves, everything. But the vast majority of the cannabinoids are present in the flowers, specifically the female flowers. There's these little gelatinous things that grow on the surface of the flowers called trichomes, which are the actual manufacturing sources for the phytocannabinoids. And so those people who are growing CBD hemp are interested in taking the flowers and extracting the cannabinoids out of that part of the plant. All right. One of the things that I've learned in the last 2 years about this plant is that it's an amazing plant. It produces many, many chemicals. Over 400 different chemicals are produced in the hemp/cannabis plant. Some people will list as many as 600, and of these, there's approximately 100 phytocannabinoids. I call it the alphabet soup, where we have designations of these different chemicals, which are large molecular weight, 300 to 350 molecular weight chemicals that are classified with 3 or 4 letter designations. The most common you hear about is, of course, CBD and delta-9 THC, but there are others. Along with these produced in the plant are many other chemicals. The terpenes are a family of aromatic chemicals that approximately 120 different terpenes, things like pinene, linolene, are grown with these other chemicals in the plant. There are proteins, there are sugars, on down the list. All kinds of interesting chemicals are produced in the hemp plant. Some of these are extracted for usages of various purposes, others are not. If you are working with the industrial hemp community, you find that the growing season is in the period of May through September. Really June to the end of August is the most intense period. At the end of the growing season, the plants are harvested, cut and transported to a drying location where they are hung to reduce the water content to about 10%. After that point, the stems and leaves are removed. A process called bucking is used to collect the buds, and then the buds are extracted. This worker on the right here, Shedrick is his name, is suited up to work with these hemp plants, because what you discover when you're growing hemp and working with hemp is that it's like a lot of farming. It's hard, nasty work in a hot environment. And he's all suited up, and it's not because of COVID, it's because of the fact that the plant material is so sticky and so unpleasant when it comes in contact with your skin as you're working and harvesting these plants. After the buds are bucked, the next step is to extract. And extraction is the process where a solvent is used to remove the chemicals of interest and collect them into a concentrate or extract, shown here on the right in a mason jar. It's a black oily material. Now, there are two popular methods which you will hear about that are used for the extraction process. One is called ethanol extraction. Ethyl alcohol is the same chemical we have in beer and wine, and it's very accepted by the public, but unfortunately ethanol is flammable, so there is some hazardous in the industrial facility working with ethanol due to that. The other is called supercritical fluid carbon dioxide. Supercritical fluid carbon dioxide requires a very high pressure in order to extract the hemp. There are certain facilities that are set up for each of these, and the argument as to which is the best is not unlike the old argument that I remember as a kid between Ford and Chevy as to which was the best. You know, people used to say Ford stands for found on road dead, and there was probably a similar saying for Chevys, you know, by the other side. But be that as it may, they all end up in the same spot, which is with this black viscous molasses-like material that's then further processed if needed in a short path distillation. Winterization means to chill it to remove certain things that are insoluble at low temperatures, and recrystallization. These white jars over here are filled with very, very pure CBD, which I'll talk about in a second. So here's a glossary of some of the most common terms that you will hear in the cannabis industry. The first of these, CBD, is what the industrial hemp industry in Virginia is all about, collecting cannabidiol. It's also something known as cannabidiolic acid. Now, along with each of these chemicals is a scientific name. The scientific name is a foot-long word. Scientific names are designed so that you could build the molecule just by simply reading the name of the molecule if you're an organic chemist. Most people are not going to be worried with those. CBD is good enough to describe the chemical that most people are interested in a variety of different products used for various types of therapies such as pain, anxiety, sleep, and so forth. The A forms of these chemicals are acids, or have a carboxylic acid on them, and that's the chemical that's actually produced in the biosynthetic pathway. In the list below, which are the other terms list, there's a term decarbing. You will hear decarbing talked about. Decarbing or decarboxylating means removing the CO2 from the A forms by heating. This is something that must be done either by putting it into an oven and baking it at 250 degrees for 20 minutes or burning the product to remove the CO2, because the active forms of these are the decarboxylated forms. The terms HPLC and GC represent two different analytical methods, both chromatography, both advanced techniques, both require trained personnel and are expensive to operate. Those are the only ways that you can differentiate the hemp and the marijuana plants from each other. There is no simple, easy way to do this. Tincture means that you're mixing the chemicals with extract of various oils. You will hear the terms when talking about products of full spectrum, broad spectrum, and isolate. Full spectrum means all they do is they take that viscous dark oil and they dilute it with something like coconut oil or MCT oil or some other type of base material, and then sell the product with a certain number of milligrams of CBD or other material in it. The broad spectrum is a refined product, and it means no THC. It is possible to have a positive test for marijuana if you're taking full spectrum, because most full spectrum products do have less than 0.3%, but it's not zero. And so therefore it is possible to throw a positive drug test. And that's one of the problems with it and what a user should be aware of if they have to take drug tests. Lastly, COA. This is something if you purchase one of these products off the shelf of a nutrition store or a drugstore or wherever, you should ask for the COA, because the COA is a certificate analysis done by an approved lab, which is called an ISO lab, that tells you exactly what's in the product. All right, here's some molecular structures. I hate to do this to you because you're probably not interested in the chemistry so much, but at any rate, I wanted to show you the difference between CBD and THC. THC produces a psychoactive effect in the brain as a result of interfering with something known as the endocannabinoid system CB1 receptors. The reason for this is because of the part of the molecule that's circled in yellow here. Notice the difference between CBD on the left and THC on the right. The CBD cannot fit into those same receptors. Therefore, CBD is not psychoactive, whereas THC is. The blue circles up here represent the carboxylic acid groups that have to be removed in order to convert CBDA into CBD and THCA into THC. And that's the process that requires heat. Here are some other common chemicals that all of which are discussed in the literature as to having various physiological or alleged benefits. I want to show you another chemical here. This is THC, the illegal material that causes a psychoactive effects. This is the 9 position on the carbon ring here where the double bond is. And this is the one that's the lock and key fit into the brain that gives the psychoactive activity. Below it is THC8. THC8 is causing a lot of news lately. And the reason is because THC8 is very similar to THC9. It is the 8 position where the double bond is instead of the 9 position. So it doesn't quite fit into the lock with the same key relationship that THC9 does, but it fits a little bit. And so it gives a little bit of an effect, maybe 10% of what THC9 does. Be that as it may, technically THC8 is not illegal. Where does THC8 come from? Well, down here, this is kind of a diol, CBD, and there's a simple chemical reaction that can be carried out to convert CBD into THC8. So this is converted into this by wrapping this ring around and making this molecule. Some people are calling this legal pot. It's not pot per se, but that's what they're calling it because under the Farm Bill, it said that all hemp products and material derived from hemp is legal. Therefore, if you derive this from hemp and convert it into this, that makes that by de facto legal. Maybe Agustin will have more to say about that in his presentation. That's the way it's currently being viewed by the public and by the industry. I'm going to cut this slide, go to this one. So again, the difference between the 2 forms of cannabis, the hemp cannabis and the pot cannabis, is that if the plant has been cultivated such that this pathway to THCA from CBG is the preferred one, then you produce a high product THC plant, whereas the opposite is true for hemp, shown down here in this one. All right, so here's some results of some hemp analyses that we have done for 300 samples received in the previous 2 years. The contents, this is just a big average just to show you what we're getting in terms of hemp. A lot of people make a lot about the genetics. A lot of people make a lot about the origin of the plant. Truthfully, I'm finding in the Shenandoah Valley, what really is more than anything else is how the plant is treated by the farmer, whether it's raised indoors or outdoors, and what the growing season is like, and ultimately, when they harvest, because they have to keep the levels of THC9 low enough that it stays below 0.3%. Because as the CBD, which is the preferred product, is increasing, so does the THC9. They're about a 20-to-1 roughly ratio, and it's all in the timing for the harvest. Once it's harvested, then the products are made. This is a summary of what people want to know if you're a regulator, or farmer, processor, or seller, in terms of what the composition of the products and plants are. And again, I reiterate, the problem with this is that there is no simple test. You cannot look at the plant And there's no spot test or ink test or anything that will tell you whether the plant is hemp or marijuana. It has to be done by an approved laboratory by approved methodology. And that is expensive. And so there's a lot of testing expense that goes into this, and that's a problem for many of the farmers. This is a CBD analysis for an oil. This is a commercial oil containing about 56% CBD. So this is one of the things that they're getting out after the extraction process. Here are some distillates. There's a D8 distillate shown here, about 71%, and a CBG. Only a few farms in Virginia are CBG farms. Most of it are CBD farms, but there are a few, and CBG is another chemical in this process that people are using for various problems that they're having. Here are some of the products that we analyze or have analyzed in the lab. Just to give you an idea, they're making everything from smokable buds, not pictured here, to vapes, to rub-ons, topicals, massage oil, you name it. There's probably a product out there that has CBD in it, including things that are being made for pets. So with that, I wanted to thank all the people that have been involved in these projects with me to date, especially the McCurney family who own Foulball Farm and Triumph Botanicals, Mike Weaver in West Virginia, Colleen and Eddie Gratton from River Bottom Hemp, and of course the pioneers in this, Glenn Rhodes, Sam Morton, and Mike Renfro. So with that, I'm going to say thanks for paying attention, and I will pass the baton to Agustin.
Before we do that, Dan, there were a couple of questions that came up in the chat, and
Okay.
I'd like to have you answer some of those.
Okay, if we have the time, I can do that.
Sure. So Peter Mantell seems to know what he's talking about. He has two very specific questions. I'll do my best to read them out to you. How is JMU dealing with the 280E aspect of dealing in MMJ?
I have no idea what he's talking about, so I can't answer that question.
Okay, so maybe we'll go ahead and follow up on that.
But I'll be happy to take an email and try to respond to an email if I could on that.
Okay, and then
those abbreviations.
Actually, I can probably deal with it, although it won't be satisfactory to Mr. Mantell. I can. It's a tax. He's asking a tax question.
Oh.
Okay.
Okay.
Why don't we ask that question again at the end of your presentation, Agustin?
Okay.
Okay, so the second question here is, how do you view the state's stance in the future on the new Delta 8 hemp-derived THC?
I don't know what the state's stance is on that. All I can tell you is that I've talked to both producers and the sellers, the people who are selling D8. I get two different parties on this. Some of the people who are in the hemp community are very opposed to D8 because they say the people that are selling D8 are taking it in through the back door. In other words, making something that should be illegal, legal. On the other side of the coin, I'm talking to the people who are selling this and making it, for that matter, and they are very pro D8, saying it has certain medicinal benefits that you're not going to get high from T8 like you would, D8 like you would from D9, but yet you can experience certain physiological benefits from it. A lot of people are taking it so they can go to sleep, for example. So there's two schools of thought, and I don't know what the regulations are at this point, other than I have been told that it is legal to sell it, buy it, possess it, since it is a hemp-derived product. But like I said, Agustin could probably touch that better than me.
Okay. Dan, one more question for you before we move on. Can you clarify a little bit about the spectrums, full spectrum, broad spectrum, and the third? When we're talking as it relates to recreational use and the legislation that comes in on July 1st, are we talking about a full spectrum?
Well, if you're talking about hemp, which is where those terms are best used, Full spectrum simply means that everything that is extracted either by CO2 extraction, ethanol extraction, or any other type of extraction is going to be diluted by adding an appropriate base oil. Everything is there, including some of the other compounds that I mentioned in the early slides, like terpenes and so forth. Broad spectrum is specifically treated to remove THC. So there's a residual amount of THC that's present. Broad spectrum means that no THC is present. There's additional chemical treatment that's gone in to remove that so that a user of it would not have any chance of a positive drug test. So you don't get a positive drug test from the other phytocannabinoids, okay? The third is isolate, and that isolate is just pure CBD. And that's obtained by doing a pentane extraction of the distillate liquid and crystallizing it out. And that's a pure product. And so you say, well, why not just go that route? Well, two reasons. First of all, isolate is just CBD. So therefore, if there are physiological benefits from the other phytocannabinoids that you get in full or broad spectrum, you're going to miss out on those. And the second reason is going to be more expensive because it's going to require additional treatment at the processing facility to get to that point before that product is made. So they're going to run a little bit higher in costs.
Okay.
Hope that helps.
Thank you very much. We'll get to more questions after this presentation from Agustin Rodriguez. He's going to present some legislative context regarding cannabis. And give a brief history leading up to HB 2312 and SB 1406. Agustin, it's yours.
Great. Thank you, Ashley. Delighted to be here to speak with you and to be a part of this presentation with Dr. Downey. Due to time and other constraints, I'm going to cover the state of marijuana regulation in Virginia at a very high level. I'm not going to be able to address tax issues, labor issues. So the gentleman who asked about 280E, he's referring to a specific federal Internal Revenue Code section that prohibits the ability to deduct expenses on illegal activity, and it's an issue that causes a lot of issues for state legal cannabis ventures. And so hopefully you kind of understand why that is as we get to the end of the conversation today. But it really is kind of an area unto itself, as are the labor issues that arise from marijuana use and the legalization of this area. And so, due to the fact that you and I don't have an attorney-client relationship, you really should not take any of my statements as constituting legal advice. There's a lot here that, unfortunately for you, but fortunately for the lawyers, is complicated about the regulation of marijuana. And so what you're going to hear today is a great start, but it's not the final say in the matter for a couple of reasons, not just because it's high level, but because there are some things other shoes yet to drop. Should you decide to allocate additional resources towards the marijuana sector, I do encourage you to do so with the advice of competent counsel. And so, as a shameless plug, I wanted to just note kind of where I'm based is Richmond, Virginia. I'm part of Troutman Pepper, which is a full-service law firm with over 1,100 attorneys. And so, we don't just practice cannabis law. We practice a lot of different legal areas. So labor, tax, zoning, real estate. We cover pretty much all of the areas. My background is tobacco. I spent 15 years in-house with Altria, which is based in Richmond. And so cannabis is sort of a new adjacency. And Dr. Downey's presentation was really fantastic. And one of the things that strikes me about the difference between tobacco and cannabis, at least for the moment, is the differences in the chemistry. Tobacco is often the story of manufacturers and consumers really focused on nicotine, and nicotine is really the focus. And that's why you've got, vapor products out there and, all those sorts of things, because people are really looking for the nicotine and trying to get away from the tar. But in cannabis, there's so many more chemicals that seem to be of interest. And so that's really the interesting part about cannabis right now, and one of the interesting parts. And so, Dr. Downey did touch on the difference between as to what is cannabis, and then the difference between marijuana and hemp. And what you heard, from him is that really cannabis is a plant. It's a type of plant, the cannabis sativa plant, which contains this very large variety of biologically active compounds, which are referred to as cannabinoids. And the two most prevalent for the moment are CBD and THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, with THC being the psychoactive component in the plant. And so really in the United States, cannabis in the U.S. is essentially classified under two primary legal classifications: marijuana and hemp. And as you've heard, they're genetically the same plant, or they come from the same plant, but the distinction for legal purposes is the concentration of THC. The U.S. has regulated cannabis since the 1920s, as you've heard. Since 1970, all forms of cannabis were treated as a Schedule I controlled substance on the Controlled Substances Act, and have been regulated by the Drug Enforcement Agency. But in late 2018, Congress passed and the President signed the 2018 Farm Bill, removing hemp, or industrial hemp, as a very specific definition, from the CSA, and making its cultivation, processing, and sale legal in the United States. And so really hemp is cannabis that has a THC concentration of no more than 0.3%, 0.3% on a dry weight basis by volume of THC, and marijuana is cannabis that contains greater than that amount of THC. And so, as Dr. Downey alluded to, there's really serious issues that come from this difference, because it's a chemical test. It's not a visual one. And so you've got this dichotomy between marijuana and hemp to deal with. And so, what you've got is, in my view, I've come to think of this these days as sort of four pathways under these two different regulatory distinctions of marijuana and hemp. And so, if you think about on sort of the right-hand side, hemp and all derivatives of hemp are legal. So you've got your classic industrial hemp that's used in concrete. You could take hemp and do a lot of non-biologically active things with it, like make clothes and make concrete. You can do lots of things with the hemp itself. But more interesting these days to folks are these cannabinoids like CBD, which are not psychoactive but have allegedly other benefits. And so that area is perfectly legal, provided that you comply with the federal and state regulations that apply to it, which I'll talk about in a second. And on the left-hand side, what you've got is marijuana. And marijuana remains at the federal level a federally illegal activity, whether it's recreational or sometimes called adult use. I'll refer to it today as adult use, or medical. These are, in fact, still federally illegal activities. And so there's an increasing number of states. As Virginia, as we'll talk about today, has both of these medical and recreational pathways, but at a federal level, they are still regulated as illegal products. And so, who's regulating? Who's the enforcers? Well, on the right-hand side with the legal hemp and hemp-derived products, you're largely talking about rules and regulations that are promulgated by the Department of Agriculture, and they have a whole process for the cultivation of hemp. the testing of hemp. They've got their own rule. They've also allowed the states to issue their own rules in replacement of theirs, as long as they approve it. So there's a whole process around cultivation of hemp. When it comes out sort of at the consumer product stage, there's a lot of questions then come up around, well, what's the purpose of the product? And so in some cases, people are making claims about the benefits of these CBD, for example, of CBD in the product. Some people just put CBD on there. The more you talk about your product having a particular benefit, the more risk you're going to have that the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, or the FDA is going to have an interest in what you're saying. FDA, both of them go to claims that are sort of illegal or claims that are not true. But FDA, Food and Drug Administration, also cares about therapeutic claims and also cares about food. And so food and beverages, using CBD in food and beverages, is also an area where FDA can take action. On the left-hand side, you've got the DEA, and you've got just generally the Department of Justice, whether it's the in Washington or this local U.S. attorneys. And there's been a tradition at the DOJ of, and more recently, and there's different, each administration has approached it somewhat differently, but there's been a tradition of not really aggressively enforcing the federal legality of marijuana in state legal regimes. And so there are different memos that have been issued, like the Cole memo in 2013, which was then rescinded by Jeff Sessions. Now Merrick Garland is the the Attorney General of the United States, and people pay attention to what he says, or what every Attorney General has to say about marijuana. And right now, Merrick Garland has said that, quote, that enforcement, quote, does not seem to me a useful use of limited resources, unquote. And so what I think this means is highly unlikely you're going to see government enforcement coming after state legal operations unless they are engaging in massive, or any kind, frankly, of interstate trafficking, and any kind of fraudulent banking or financial reporting. Those are the kinds of things where you can still see activity by the feds, and you should obviously stay away from. So today, what you've really got is in the 30-some states that have legalized recreational and/or medical regimes, you've really got kind of 36 different countries, none of which are allowed to import or export their marijuana, and that's kind of the way we're operating today. With this sort of federal overhang. So let me move on to Virginia. Let's talk about Virginia. And where are we in Virginia today? Well, where we are today is today, for the next couple of days, we have a medical marijuana cannabis program. And that really began in 2016. It's overseen by the State Board of Pharmacy. And for the medical cannabis program, the state was divided up into 5 health service areas, and each can have one pharmaceutical processor. Pharmaceutical processors are vertically integrated businesses. That means cultivation, manufacturing, and retail all operate out of the same location. Each pharmaceutical processor is allowed to open an additional 5 dispensaries within their health service area. But none have done so as far as I've heard. The medical cannabis program progressed quickly from really restricting use of medical cannabis to severe cases of epilepsy, to really any condition that a physician would find would benefit from medical cannabis. And so that's kind of the approach. The pharmaceutical processors are going to have the ability to participate in the adult use regime that I'm about to talk about, which takes us to Virginia's new law, the Virginia Cannabis Control Act. And so the The CCA, as I'll call it, was enacted by the General Assembly and signed by the governor earlier this year. And it creates a cannabis control authority, which is overseen by a board of directors, along with a Cannabis Public Health Advisory Council and a Virginia Cannabis Equity Business Loan Fund. So as of July 1 of this year, home cultivation of up to 4 plants and personal possession up to 1 ounce is legalized. But not until July 1st of 2023 is the board, or the authority often referred to as the board, are they going to be able to start accepting applications for licenses to actually participate in the commercial side of this. And in that process, preference is going to be given to what are called or defined as social equity businesses up until January 1 of 2024. A social equity business is a business that's 66% owned by a number of different categories. And I'll just read a couple of them off. So a person who's been convicted of certain crimes relating to marijuana, or someone who's a family member of such a person who's resided for 3 of the last 5 years in a jurisdiction that's been, quote, disproportionately policed for marijuana crimes, unquote. Someone who's lived 3 of the 5 last years in a jurisdiction that is, quote, economically distressed, unquote. And finally, someone who's a graduate of a historically black college in the Commonwealth. And so these businesses will have access to the Cannabis Equity Business Loan Fund. And then, as I mentioned here, commercial sales. Well, commercial sales aren't going to allowed to begin until January 1 of 2024. Query how they'll actually get there, given the timing that Dr. Downey just talked about with respect to cultivation and then processing. I mean, obviously these things take time and effort. Not sure what kind of quality we'll get that first round, but in any event, the board will be expected to have regulations issued beginning in summer of 2022. So here's the funny thing about this is that the majority of the act has to be reenacted by the General Assembly, and that's going to happen in 2022. My understanding is that's kind of the January 2022 through March 2022 time period. Certain things will not be reenacted. Those are things like the actual Cannabis Control Authority and this Public Health Advisory Council that I mentioned, and the Equity Business Loan Fund that I mentioned. These don't have to be reenacted. Also, the home cultivation, personal possession, and amendments to the criminal code will not be reenacted. But most of the commercial meat of the program, like licensing, taxes, advertising, those types of things will have to be reenacted. So then let's talk about the commercial side of this and what it looks like. Well, basically there are 5 kinds of available licenses here. Cultivators, of course, are the ones who grow the marijuana. They cultivate it, but they may also sell seeds and immature plants direct to the consumer. Manufacturers, of course, are creating products such as edibles, oils, and topicals, like the ones that Dr. Downey indicated earlier. Testers. Well, testing sites, they'll test the marijuana products for compliance with any quality control standards. Wholesalers may buy and sell marijuana and marijuana products to other licensees, or may just facilitate transport. But licensees are also permitted to transport among each other. So wholesalers will not have a monopoly on transport. And then finally, retailers, or what are referred to as dispensaries, those are the ones who will sell to consumers above the age of 21. There aren't any application or licensing fees that have yet been set. Those are for the determination of the Cannabis Control Authority. I want to talk about local governments for a moment, because they do have the ability to influence this process. The Cannabis Control Authority doesn't have will not have the ability to grant a license to any business that's not in compliance with any rules that are established by the host locality. And localities also have been given authority to ban cannabis businesses within their borders. So to ban ban cannabis business or a type of cannabis business, you have to pass a referendum. A referendum has to be held within the locality. The governing body of the locality actually has to pass a resolution, and then has to petition the court for a referendum. The court has to, approve it. And then the referendum, importantly, the referendum has to be held by December 31 of 2022. At that point, voters will either vote yes or no. And if they vote to ban it, then there can be no subsequent referendum for 4 years. In addition to being able to pass, tax regulations, we expect that governments should be able to pass, zoning, land use, business license requirements. I will tell you that in my opinion, the act is not clear beyond that as to what sorts of regulations localities can or cannot pass. There's a very clear statutory provision that says that a local government may not, quote, adopt any ordinance or resolution that regulates or prohibits the cultivation, manufacture, possession, sale, wholesale, distribution, handling, transportation, consumption, use, advertising, or dispensing of retail marijuana or retail marijuana products in the Commonwealth. So it's pretty darn broad, and I'll be surprised if there isn't additional regulation to try to define what that's supposed to mean, and then litigation around it to the extent that localities are looking to micromanage business in this area. Licensing restrictions, and I'm getting to the end of my presentation here. So there are some potential restrictions on licensing that the folks might want to be aware of. The CCA, the Act, empowers but does not require the board to refuse to grant licenses to companies that are owned by at least 10% by a manufacturer, distributor, or retailer of alcoholic beverages or retailer of tobacco products. And the board is going to have to pass implementations and that will we'll have to pass regulations to determine whether this restriction will be implemented. Also, generally, there's a prohibition on vertical integration. So you can be a cultivator, but you're not going to be able to be a dispensary. You can be a tester, but you can't be a manufacturer. Generally speaking, the general rule will be no vertical integration. There are going to be a couple of exceptions. Those are the 5 pharmaceutical processors that I mentioned earlier under the Medical Marijuana Act. They're going to get to be a participant in this, and they're going to get to be vertically integrated. Also, licensed industrial hemp processors who are currently regulated, they also can participate. It appears, however, that to do so, they will have to pay a much more hefty fee than I would expect others to pay. That fee is set in the statute at $1 million. So, but that may be worth it. That may be worth it to them. And in any event, the board will be empowered to evaluate new licensees based on the number of licensees a locality already has, so that the board is expected to promote the CCA's goal of making sure there's geographic dispersion of dispensaries and not overconcentration. So that's kind of my high-level review, and I'll stop there.
All right. Thank you so much, Agustin and Dan. We so appreciate this. As we mentioned, we're going to do a pause at 1 o'clock to be respectful of the time of those of you that need to perhaps get back to work after lunch. But we will stay on for about 15 or so minutes and keep recording any additional questions that may come up. A reminder that the recording of today's event will be emailed. It'll include contact information for the panelists, along with a survey to collect your input, additional questions, comments. We really want those so that we can help formulate the next 2 forums. That'll go out to you by email this week. SHRM Participants, the PDC activity code will be at the end of the survey. Also want to say again, thank you to our sponsors. First, let me go back, save the date. It's going to be Monday, August 23rd and Monday, October 25th. That's the fourth Monday of those months. Lunch and Learn again. And again, thank you to our major sponsor, Blue Ridge Bank, and our bronze sponsor, Your CBD Store over in Creekside Station. Thank you all for being with us today. Thanks for being part of this conversation, and we look forward to seeing you again at upcoming forums. I'm going to go ahead and end officially here at 1 o'clock. Thanks for attending. And Ashley, if you'll take over, we do have some questions in the Q&A that we'll attempt to let Agustin and Dan handle for us.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to start with Agustin, and I'm just going to ask you to quickly sum up what happens 4 days from now. What is, in just a few sentences, what becomes legal July 1st?
Yeah, so you've got the, it's legal to possess the, I'll go back up to my slide on this in case you guys want to see it, but it's basically, you're going to get legalization of home cultivation up to 4 plants, and then personal possession of 1 ounce.
1 ounce of
marijuana.
Okay. I'm going back to questions in the chat here. Okay, so some things came up, Agustin, about the reenactment in 2022. Can you expand on that? And I think specifically the asker is wanting to consider whether a different political agenda entering in 2022 could change Virginia's legalization process.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I wanted to raise it to this group, because, you know, my sense is that this is a group that's going to care about the political process. And, you know, we do have November coming up. There's a lot of different opportunities politically out there in November. And so while it's not entirely going to derail, certainly it will not derail the criminal side of this. There is a possibility, and obviously General Assembly can always pass anything it wants. I would have to move pretty quick because it'll be coming in January. If it's let's say the General Assembly were to flip Republican, obviously they'd be coming in January. They'd have to move pretty quickly through their session to address any issues they've got with the current process. And really the idea is, if anything, would be to focus on the commercial side of this.
Okay. So we don't know if you can answer these questions yet, but I'm going to go ahead and pose it to you. What does it mean, or what controls are in place for testing and enforcing new recreational use legislation? And what does that mean for employers who have drug policies? Yeah.
So that I'm not an employment lawyer, and so I'm really not able to get into that to answer that question. But I would encourage folks to consult with their employment counsel, you know, about this sort of thing. You know, it is not intended. There is an element here that is not intended. I mean, at a high level, what I would say is this is kind of intended to bring it more closer to alcohol. Maybe it's one way to think about it. You know, in terms of people's use of the product, in terms of people's possession of the product. But there's still, you know, some criminal exposure possible for even for folks who are legally possessing, and so also what employment policies you may have, what requirements you may have. Employment lawyers are, I'm sure, thinking very hard about these things.
Maybe that's something we can expand on in a subsequent forum. Okay, so I'm going back to the Q&A section here. One of our attendees asked, Did the Virginia Assembly explicitly authorize the localities to impose bans by amending Dillon's rule or through some other legislative action?
So that's a really great question. I don't believe that Dillon's rule has been amended. I have to think about that question in terms of, and this is what I was trying to highlight earlier, is it's quite clear that the General Assembly has authorized localities to impose bans through this referendum process. I don't think that that is a violation of Dillon's rule. In fact, I think it is consistent with Dillon's rule. What is unclear is the extent to which they can further regulate unbanned activity within their localities. And I think that's going to be something that will be interesting unless the regulations that are issued are clear and accepted and unchallenged. The more if those are clear and accepted and unchallenged, then it'll certainly be clear, accepted, and unchallenged. So.
Okay, thank you.
Just by the way, for all of you who don't care about Dillon's rule, I'll just tell you that Dillon's rule really is a rule in Virginia that basically says that the legislature that localities only have as much power as the legislature devolves to the localities at a very high level. That's kind of the rule. So in Virginia, localities are pretty restricted generally from imposing new rules and regulations on businesses. They have to pretty much be given the authority by the Virginia General Assembly.
Thank you, Agustin. Okay, so there are questions on here about licensing fees, and
we do not know yet. That will be for the authority to determine through regulation.
Okay, and also I expect that this question kind of lives in that same space. Dispensaries, will they be required to exclusively sell marijuana products just, for example, the way that the ABC stores are limited to alcohol? Or will they possibly be sold at other businesses such as convenience stores and vape shops?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't recall seeing anything saying they had to only sell marijuana products, but I do think this will be something that will be the subject of regulation. And it would not surprise me if that were in fact the case, that a dispensary is really going to end up being a dedicated retail operation because of the 21 plus, because of convenience stores, anybody can walk into them. I don't see dispensary licenses being granted to convenience stores. And also, there's this general kind of tip of the hat I mentioned earlier in the legislation that seems to, somewhat be prejudiced against retailers of tobacco and alcohol. So, I suspect we're going to see something more like what you see in other states where it's going to be a dedicated marijuana only dispensary.
Okay. Let's talk about the 4 plants on July 1st. You can cultivate up to 4 plants at home, but we talked early on about maybe the potential for some black market activity and acquiring. How do you start 4 plants at home without breaking the law as it is now? Yeah,
that's a great question. I don't know if Dr. Downey's heard anything differently from the sourcing of the seed and how that's all supposed to work. There will be regulations issued around that point eventually. So what I can tell you is, it's 4 per household. Later when it's legal, they can buy from cultivators. But for now, I don't foresee a whole lot of enforcement based on where you got it from. I do think it's a good issue. It's a good question to raise. It's sort of like, where'd it come from? But I don't foresee a whole lot of enforcement issues in that respect.
Dan, did you want to touch on that, or are you in agreement?
I'm obviously in agreement, but there is a potential for seed that is intended to be hemp to possibly be developed into marijuana by cultivating it in such a fashion that it would follow the THCA synthase pathway. I suppose that's a possibility, but not a very realistic one for most people. Otherwise, I have no idea where their plants are going to come from.
Okay. All right, I'm going to do a last call for questions. We've lost about 20 participants. 45 are still hanging out here. Are there any other additional questions for Agustin or Dan? Keeping in mind that questions we can't or haven't answered here today, we'll be looking forward to answering with the following two panels. This is an interesting question. Dan, how many testing labs are available in Virginia?
There were at least 6 early on, but I think some of them have been incorporated into another business. In other words, they've combined testing labs into another business. So I know of 2 major ones. One's East Coast Catalytics, which operates out of Blacksburg, and the other East Coast Catalytics, it operates out of Blacksburg, and the other one is Sativa Labs, which is near Richmond. Those are the ones that I deal mostly with.
Okay.
To get to be an ISO certified lab is a large amount of time commitment and a large amount of resource commitment. And many of the labs that are testing labs around the nation were labs that were testing for pharmaceutical products or forensics or something like that already, and just adapted the laboratory to do the testing for THC, CBD, and all the other phytocannabinoids. It's an expensive operation to do testing. And the people who are getting their products tested discover this when they start purchasing the analytical tests by sending samples in and finding out the cost. For a complete screening for a single sample, you'd be looking at something on the order of $600. And that's going to be done multiple times on a wide variety of plants and products. So this is not a low-cost deal at all.
And it's my understanding, Dan, that if you pull a sample to be tested, and that test takes too long for the results to be returned to the farm, that there is a chance that the product that has yet to be cultivated could have increased in its level of THC content.
Absolutely. What we found in our testing for certain farmers in this neighborhood was that the increase of CBD and THC, which parallels one another, occurs within a week's time at the end of the growing season. It just suddenly starts producing and producing and producing, and that below 0.3 suddenly goes above 0.3, and that could be the time that you're sampled for legality. Quite frankly, if I use the soapbox here for a second, the 0.3% doesn't make any sense. It's way too low. There's talk about raising it to 1%, but that's going to have to be raised at the federal level. That would be far more meaningful for people who are actually growing hemp, because none of the hemp growers that I know are actually growing it for the sake of producing marijuana. They want hemp. It's just this byproduct, and it's a very, very low criterion. 0.3 means 99.7% something else on a dry weight basis. And so that is just, to me, it's unrealistic for those people who are trying to produce CBD hemp. It's a tough measure to meet.
Yeah, it's tough. Also, in my opinion, it would need to be raised by Congress, because, you've got the USDA regulating hemp, and they're inclined to help farmers out. They're inclined to, certainly make their regulations somewhat more manageable, although I think they're not quite fitting the bill yet. But then you've got the DEA, and the USDA is not the boss of the DEA, and they all have their own approaches to things. So, it really will take, in my view, for there to be real clarity, it will take congressional action to make that work.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to ask another interesting question just came in. What happens if the 4 plants at home for cultivation produce more than 1 ounce of marijuana? And to clarify, I think when we say 1 ounce, we mean 1 ounce of what? The bud that comes off the plant? Or is it 1 ounce of plant material?
We're talking about the bud that comes off the plant or the flower.
Okay. And so what happens if your 4 plants produce more than 1 ounce of marijuana? I think the simple answer might be don't pull it off the plant.
I don't know what, well, that might be the simple answer. I'm just not sure if it's physically possible to produce that much from 4 plants. It's a good question. I don't know the answer.
Yeah, you can produce more than 1 ounce off 4 plants. By the time those things get 6 or 8 feet high and they're producing buds all over the place, they'll be more than 1 ounce.
So look out.
So what happens if they do produce more than 1 ounce? You leave it on the plant and then it does not.
Well, I think that the 1 ounce provision is really meant for traffic, for moving around, possession. How much can you have on yourself at any given time? But I think there's a lack of clarity there as to whether it could be enforced in the house. Certainly would say don't leave the house with more than 1 ounce in your possession.
Okay, thank you. Christina asks, how much of the hemp has to be destroyed if the sample goes over 0.3%?
Well, that depends upon the way the samples were taken. In one case that I know, the farmer had 4 different plots. 3 of the plots were below 0.3%. The 4th, which was physically isolated from the other 3, the entire crop had to be destroyed. So it was just that 1/4 of the total production, fortunately for that farmer. But that was just the samples that were taken from that one plot. There is a protocol that they go through in terms of the collection and determination of the samples. They actually give the farmer a second opportunity. They'll come back and collect more samples. If he argues with them and says, no, I really was not over 0.3%, you need to check it again. But the bottom line is that if you have, say, an acre plot that tests higher than 0.3%, all 1 acre has to be destroyed.
Okay, thank you. And another quick question, is CBD water soluble? Can it be turned into a refreshing beverage?
Okay, technically, no, it's not. CBD and the other phytocannabinoids are all non-soluble in water, but you can use a carrier. And there are some products that are using carrier to carry the CBD or other cannabinoids into the beverage. So there are some that are being sold. My feeling about it is, why bother? I mean, if you're interested in CBD, there are other ways to ingest CBD, such as the tinctures or the gummies, that would give you the dose that you want in a regulated fashion rather than drinking a beverage. I don't see any point in it. But one of my students, the first year that we were doing this research, commented one day in lab. He says, "I think there's CBD being added to everything except motor oil. This is everything out there has had CBD impregnated into it one way or another." It's really fascinating just how explosive that growth was. But I don't see much point in putting it in beverages, but they do make them.
Okay. And can Virginia grown product be certified out of state? Cynthia, did you want to expand on that?
I think I wondered if we've got someone growing here, does it have to be certified within the state? Or I would assume it can't cross state lines and go to another state to another testing lab, so that process will be exclusive to a Virginia-based company? That be
Right. That's certainly going to be the expectation under the new act, is that these testing facilities will be licensed and they'll be in the state, so you can send it to testing facilities in the state. And that was my reaction when I saw the question. Was that crossing the state line creates a pretty big hurdle.
Well, I know crossing the state line is already being done quite a bit. You know, we're in Rockingham County, which is right next to West Virginia, and there's a lot of cross-pollination between the two states. Some of the farmers that I know are actually raising crops in West Virginia. And there's a limited number of extractors in Virginia, and that's been one of the limitations to the hemp industry, that people still have 2019 hemp that they've stored, but they couldn't get it processed because there wasn't enough extractors. We now have 2 set up here in Rockingham County that are extracting, but there is a backlog. One of the extractor facilities told me the other day that he is booked through the month of September already to extract hemp, because there's just a limited capacity for extraction. And so a lot of the people in Rockingham County that are getting things extracted are sending them across the state line into West Virginia to extractors over there. So there's a lot of cross-pollination right now between the 2 states. I don't know if it's illegal or not, but I know they're doing it.
Well, I think if it's hemp, if it's truly hemp, that's going to be a different story. That shouldn't be federally illegal at all. But if it's marijuana, high THC hemp or high THC cannabis, then I do think it implicates certainly both, not just federal, but also federal and state laws, even in the state legal regimes. You know, there's still, interstate is still generally not permitted. So it just depends on what the underlying product is. I will tell you, on the hemp side, there are a few states that are banning hemp too. So, you know, they don't tend to be in our area, but I think of Idaho in particular. They've been real problematic with hemp.
So are there any barriers, current or potential barriers, for delivering CBD or processed hemp products across state lines?
Again, for purposes of hemp as such, they're going to be, whatever barriers are going to be state law barriers. They shouldn't be federal barriers. You've got to comply. You know, the hemp has to come and be derived from the pursuant to the cultivation requirements that we've talked about. And then any other barriers that would occur for otherwise, CBD from a hemp product are going to be mostly in the area of advertising. Nothing's stopping you from crossing a state line, typically, unless you're in one of these weird states like Idaho. But even then, if it's truly like going through Idaho to another state, you're okay. You should be okay. Other than that, you're just in the sort of regulatory landscape that I was describing earlier.
All right. Questions. So I think this is for you, Agustin. Does the $1 million requirement create potential competitive advantages for non-experienced Virginia residents looking to enter the market versus multi-state operators from outside this state?
That's a hard question to ask. I would say that the 5 entities that established, or really 4 now, because one of them went defunct and they're still trying to issue the 5th one. But they're local people, but they are partnered with outside the state companies. I know the one in Richmond, for example, is partnered with a Maryland company. And so they're clearly going to come in with their view of, they've clearly got experience that can be very helpful and provide for more efficient processes. the legislature provided for social equity participants, businesses, to try to give them a leg up. I just don't know that $1 million is going to be enough to stop these pharma processors and industrial hemp processors from entering and applying for these. If anything, I mean, it's a tax, but I don't think it's going to stop them from entering. And so I do think that they will come with, you know, their existing experience, and they'll be their own forces to contend with.
Okay, thank you. So the last question that was in our Q&A box was about Delta 8. Can it currently be prescribed? And I think that leads to a little bit more discussion around the medical use marijuana, the 5 licenses, and a little bit of the regulation around that.
All the hemp-derived products are considered to be nutritional supplements, dietary supplements, food supplements, whatever you want to call them, but not medicines. They're not prescription medicines. So I do not believe that any medical professionals are prescribing Delta 8 or anything else at this point in time that's in the hemp family of chemicals. That being said, I do know of medical professionals who have recommended Delta 8 to patients. Again, anecdotal, not something that many people are doing, but certainly certain people in the medical community say, yes, maybe you should try this, but not prescribing it per se.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think the Delta 8 issue, it just illustrates, you know, this very narrow, this sort of very narrow exception that Congress put in place around what constitutes marijuana. You know, it's greater than 0.3% of Delta 9 THC. And so, you know, people have said, well, what about Delta 8? And for crying out loud, if there's a Delta 10, that's whatever, you know, however many deltas there are. If it's psychoactive, but it comes from hemp, you know, why isn't that legal? And I think it's a really good question. You know, I think that is a really good question that I can tell you the DEA has not bought into it, but I think they've got a real issue on their hands with that because, you know, the statute says what the statute says.
Okay, so as we approach 1:30, I want to ask each of you to, now we're down a couple of participants, but they will be reviewing the end of our forum here. So what are some things that our business community should be thinking about or questions they should be preparing as the committee comes together to regulate this new legislation? What are some questions that the business community should be paying attention to or asking for answers on?
In my mind, you know, is a sort of, I think this is going to be a local, it's going to start off as a local business activity. And so I think that businesses should be, you know, communicating with their chambers of commerce and should be communicating with their localities and you know, getting ahead of this with respect to their localities and how their localities will approach this. This, you know, will they be business friendly or will they be, you know, more kind of, I'll just say socially conservative about it and say, we don't want this kind of thing in our backyard. And so, you know, that's going to be in the short term, you know, important around issues of zoning, for example, will probably be, you know, the most important issues over the next 2 years locally.
Okay, thank you. Dan, is there any last thoughts for us?
I think that the best way to judge what's going to happen with medical marijuana, recreational marijuana in the future is basically look at what happened out west. I mean, basically the same thing happened with hemp. This has happened in Virginia with hemp. And I just think that what has happened in Oregon, Colorado, California, and so forth, things seem to be blowing from the west towards the east. And I just suspect that will probably follow a similar path of development here in Virginia.
Great, thank you. I'm going to
Thank
turn
you
it back
so
over.
much for, sorry about that, Ashley. Go ahead.
That's okay. I was going to turn it back over to you anyway.
Thank you so much, Ashley, Dan, and Agustin. This has been a great educational opportunity, I believe, for all of our members and participants. You've done a great job taking a really high level and making it palatable to those of us who are really new to this conversation. Thank you for those of you who have been with us today for attending this Copper Virginia Regional Chamber Marijuana Forum presented by Blue Ridge Bank. We'll see you again, hopefully, in August.